Good morning and welcome. I'm Lauren Reese, and together with my colleagues in the Stimson Center's Environmental Security Program, it's my privilege to welcome you to this discussion on protecting water in the mining rush, lessons from Africa and Southeast Asia. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Stimson Center is a nonpartisan think tank focused on advancing international security through research, policy innovation, and collaboration with communities and countries around the world. Our environmental security program helps decision makers unpack the complex risks at the intersection of environment, health, population, and security. We're hosting this event just ahead of World Water Day, and the timing couldn't be more fitting. The world's demand for critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, copper, and others essential for the clean energy transition is accelerating rapidly. But so are the risks to water. From tailings dam collapses to toxic spills, from over-extraction in arid regions to chemical runoff into rivers, communities are paying a steep price. This isn't just an environmental story. For many of these communities, the water being put at risk is their source of drinking water. It's critical to subsistence farming and livelihoods. It sits at the center of daily life. When mining degrades or disrupts access to it, the consequences are immediate and personal. That's also why the conflict dimension of this issue is more complex than it might first appear. Yes, water insecurity and conflicts over mining can spark protests, litigation, and conflict. A study by the Institute of Development Studies found that between 2015 and 2022, there were over 36,000 mineral mining-related conflict events globally. This has real implications for supply chains, including those necessary to advancing the clean energy transition. But we should be careful not to let supply chain concerns crowd out the more fundamental point. Communities have rights. The right to clean and safe water is recognized in international law, and when that right is violated, conflict is often not just an outcome, it's a signal that something has gone wrong much earlier in the process. Today, we've brought together 4 experts who are looking at this challenge from very different vantage points. We'll hear from the panel for the first 30 minutes or so before opening it up to questions. Please feel free to send in your questions at any point in our discussion, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. We're going to hear first from Susanna Schmeier. Susanna is a professor of water cooperation, law, and diplomacy at IHE Delft, the world's leading institute for water education, and Utrecht University in the Netherlands. She advises governments and international organizations on managing shared water resources and the environment. We invited Susanna to open our discussion with a global lens. Her work sits at the intersection of water law, transboundary governance, and conflict prevention, which means she can help us understand not just what is happening on the ground, but why our existing institutions are or aren't equipped to address it. We'll next hear from Aubert Boré. Aubert is a programs manager at the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Organization, a public interest legal organization that uses law to protect communities and the environment in Zimbabwe and across Southern Africa. Aubert is a Mandela Rhodes Scholar and a lawyer trained in international trade law who has spent years investigating the impacts of mining on communities, with a particular focus on Chinese investments in Africa. We invited Aubert because of his expertise and experience working on the ground with communities where the water has been polluted and the regulatory response has been inadequate. He gives voice to the accountability gap that makes the legal and governance frameworks Susanna describes so urgently needed. Reagan Kwan is a research analyst in the Stimson Center Southeast Asia program, where he has been leading an innovative effort to track the proliferation of mining along rivers in mainland Southeast Asia and understand its consequences for water health, local ecosystems, and communities. We invited Reagan to bring a data lens to a problem that is often discussed in the abstract. His team's dashboard visualizes where mining is happening, how it's expanding, and what it's doing to river systems, making the invisible visible and giving advocates, policymakers, and journalists a new tool to demand accountability. And finally, we'll hear from Scott Selwood. Scott is the civil society sector lead at the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, or IRMA, which has developed the world's most comprehensive independent standard for socially and environmentally responsible mining. Scott is an environmental lawyer and geographer who spent nearly a decade at Oxfam advocating for land, climate, and economic justice before joining IRMA. We asked Scott to participate because he represents a critical question. What does better actually look like? IRMA's standard has a dedicated chapter on water management, and Scott can tell us both what best practices require, and where the mining sector is falling short. Okay, we're going to start with you, Susanna. To help us frame this discussion, can you talk us through what are the most pressing water challenges linked to critical minerals mining globally, particularly around governance and conflict risk? And is the current system of international frameworks equipped to handle the pace of extraction that we're seeing? Over to you.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for the invitation. I'll keep it very short when it comes to the challenges of mining and rather general, because I'm sure the other panelists will provide many more very local details. But broadly, we can say that mining, and here we're talking the extraction, yes, but especially the processing of minerals affects water in terms of water quantity and water quality. And here we can think, when we think about water quantity, availability, for example, of the Atacama Desert, where we're seeing lithium mining affecting the groundwater availability for local communities who are increasingly concerned about these effects and see their livelihoods and their own water uses increasingly threatened. But we're also seeing it in terms of water quality, in terms of pollution, when we think, for example, about South Africa, where both existing but also abandoned mines have been and still are causing a number of water quality challenges, which we've also seen lead to local conflicts, to grievances, to effects on livelihoods, which ultimately might spill over in, well, legitimate, we can say, protests. So we do see a number of challenges at the local level, but we also see them at the national level. But, and I want to add that dimension, we also see them very much at the transboundary dimension, because water does move from one country to another, and with that movement move the impacts, whether that's quantity or quality. And one example that has recently made the headlines is mining in Myanmar and the effects on communities, water availability, health, and so on, that we've seen in the Kok River, not only in Myanmar, but spilling over to Thailand. And as the rush to mine more minerals, critical minerals in particular, is increasing, and as the world is moving towards more and more mining to meet our, well, seemingly ever-growing needs for that, we will also see an increase in these challenges. And this is specifically the case because many of the mining operations happen in places that are already water scarce. There are studies from the World Resources Institute, but also from the German Heinrich Böll Foundation, that show that a vast majority of the mines that are currently being established are in areas that are water stressed. But then in addition to that, we're also seeing quite a bit of mining happening or planned to happen in countries, in places that struggle already with instability and fragility. So we'll definitely see an increase in direct mining related challenges, but also the social, the political consequences and the conflicts that arise from them. And that also very much has to do with a lack of effective governance frameworks. So it's not only the mining itself and its effects on water quantity and quality, but it's also the fact that there are very few effective governance frameworks available that would help us to address these impacts, to mitigate different interests, to address issues of competition over water, or to assign clear responsibility and liability to water quality damages, for example. And this is, again, the case all the way from the very local level, where there might be no regulation available, or where there might be regulation that very much favors mining and industries over local needs. Chile is an interesting example for that. But that goes on to the national level, where often insufficient regulation exists for mining, or that regulation exists, but it's not being implemented, either because it's not prioritized by governments, or because the agencies, the government agencies responsible for that, are insufficiently staffed or insufficiently financially equipped, or because we're facing all sorts of issues relating to corruption, favoritism, and so on. And then that continues all the way to the transboundary or even the global level, where there's hardly any legal mechanisms available for mining, some more soft law mechanisms that are insufficiently implemented. But we're also on the water law side, so on the side where we do have quite some strict regulation at the international level, we're seeing increasingly less commitment to water law principles that could also apply to mining. So if we look at principles such as the principle of no significant harm, which can come in the case of water quality damages, for example, we do see also in the research that we are doing a decreasing commitment of countries to these principles. So I think this is sort of the bigger framework when it comes to these challenges. I just want to add one more point, zooming out a little bit and maybe taking a bit of a more bigger picture perspective. What we're also seeing is an increasing securitization of natural resources, both on the mineral side and on the water side. So we do see countries rushing to securing their own national interests and to attaching a real national security connotation to minerals by limiting exports, by rushing to secure supplies in other countries, investing, and so on. So we're moving from a sort of natural resources development exploitation perspective to sort of an additional securitization perspective, which makes cooperation much more difficult as we're moving more and more into a zero-sum game thinking. And we're seeing similar developments in the water space, where I would say that idea of a community of interest was much more developed at some point, but also here we're seeing a bit of a pushback towards a more nationalization and securitization of water resources. And then, of course, due to that strong interlinkage between water and mining, those kind of reinforce each other and potentially lead to some sort of a vicious cycle of increasing securitization of both minerals and water, which of course decreases our ability to address collective action problems cooperatively if we're all just trying to make our own country great again. And I'll leave it at that for the moment. Thanks, Lauren.
Okay, Susanna, thank you. Can I ask one quick follow-up, though, just before we move on? Because you have spent so much time sort of thinking about transboundary contracts and where there are sort of governance frameworks that can be effective. For those of you watching online, I would direct you to an article that Susanna wrote for New Security Beat for us that gets into that point you were making about the fact that some of these agreements aren't working as well as they used to, right? Okay, let's kind of, are there any sort of examples of frameworks or policy levers where you do see some potential for effective governance in this space? Like, or which ones would you point to as potential levers for sort of countering a lot of the issues that you raised?
Specifically for the transboundary level, you mean, I think?
Yeah, sorry, for the transboundary level.
There is a rich framework available that ranges from obligations to conduct transboundary environmental impact assessments, which are obviously important generally for mining, and then specifically for water, which we find under the ESPO Convention. We also have very relevant instruments when it comes to indigenous and human rights law. And we have that whole water law regime at the global level that clearly defines that you should be using water resources in an equitable and reasonable utilization, and that you shouldn't be causing significant harm, both of which can be affected by mining. And there are a number of policy frameworks that we have in the water space, but also in the mining space when it comes to OECD due diligence guidance, but also other international organization or even private sector association frameworks. The challenge is more, as so often with international law, the implementation. And what we're seeing there in our research, specifically on water, but my gut feeling would be it's the same or even worse for mining, is that the interest of countries to follow these principles and to implement them is decreasing. And that is a bit of a vicious cycle that's emerging, because it also has a model function. As bigger countries, well-known countries that so far tended to stick to international law and international principles are doing that less and less. That obviously also has a role model function for other countries. And we do see, unfortunately, that increase in sticking to the rules, but at the same time also being open for cooperation and wanting to address problems that clearly are collective action problems, that clearly do require joint action in a cooperative way.
Okay, thank you, Susanna. Aubert, let's come to you. Susanna outlined a number of sort of significant challenges at multiple levels, sort of whether from the local to the international. Can you share with us how you see these challenges playing out on the ground in Zimbabwe? What kinds of tensions or conflicts related to water use and pollution are arising between mining companies and local communities? And where do you see opportunity? I keep just adding on to the questions, I'm sorry, but where do you see opportunities to address some of these issues? Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for that very important question, I think, which is very fundamental when we think about this rush to critical minerals and access to resources. So from my perspective, I think the starting point, at least from Global South and being from Zimbabwe, is to say Zimbabwe has also emerged as one of the top lithium producers globally. I think in Africa, Zimbabwe's production for lithium has surpassed, I think, all the other countries, and he has been one of the largest global producers when you look at, other countries that compete. So the starting point is to understand that this is a key resource, obviously needed for the energy transition, but the country is also trying to maximize and benefit out of this resource, given that everyone is trying to get their hands onto lithium. And therefore, when you do an analysis of trying to understand where is the lithium extracted in Zimbabwe, one of the stark reality you will find is that it is extracted in water scarce regions, particularly your region 4 and 5. So the country is divided into 5 regions, and 4 and 5 are the driest regions. Therefore, when there is extraction of this very important resource in a region that is already dry, they tend to be structural conflict, because one of the things that, for instance, the government has been trying to push for is value addition and beneficiation. And in fact, you might be aware that the government of Zimbabwe banned the export of raw or unprocessed or unbeneficiated lithium. And therefore, the question is, so what goes into this process? Water is a major ingredient when it comes to processing hard rock, particularly hard rock spodumene lithium that is found in Zimbabwe. So therefore, you are sitting in a region that is already dry, but at the same time, the government policy is compelling and pushing companies to invest in processing plants, invest in facilities that require huge amounts of water. Just to put this into context, when you speak to the companies on the ground, they indicate that they require at least in excess of 50,000 liters of water to process just 1 ton of lithium, which is very significant, which is massive, given that the regions, the areas where the extraction and the processes are happening is already dry. So what are we seeing? How are these water and mining conflicts emerging in Zimbabwe? So access, as Susanna has also mentioned, is also become a major issue, given that there is now competition over a limited resource between companies who require the water for processing, but also communities that require water for other livelihoods and their livestock for agricultural purposes and so forth. So from the work that we have done as an organization, as Zimbabwe Environmental Law Organization, we have noticed that there are a number of pollution cases related particularly to extraction of lithium. So just one example is Bikita Minerals, which has been one of the largest producers of lithium on the continent, that has been held accountable by our environmental management authority or agency for polluting a major dam that communities rely on. So Bikita Minerals is owned by Sinomine Resources Group, which is also a major investor in the Zimbabwean context in lithium. And they're in charge of this very large project that is feeding into the global supply chain. So after the company was involved in this particular venture, they invested in expanding their processing plant, and as a result, the effluent that is toxic coming out of their plant has gone into the environment, into this water body, and they were fined just $5,000, which is the highest in terms of the Zimbabwean level of fines. So they were fined 5,000. Then the question is this enough to remedy the damage that has been done to the environment? This obviously is not commensurate to the impact, not only on the environment, but also on the other, communities, but also other related ecosystems that rely on this particular, water board. So we have seen a challenge around, how deterrent or ineffective the current environmental laws are in terms of actually punishing the companies so that they are able to comply. So that's one major challenge that we are seeing in Zimbabwe, that the law is not sufficient, the law is not punitive enough, and therefore, because of this rush, companies end up just polluting and paying the fine because it's cheaper and it's easier for them, right? So this is very important because this has not only played out only in Zimbabwe. When you look at across the region, particularly in Zambia, for instance, you see that similar cases of water pollution, particularly from extracting or processing critical minerals, are also playing out. For instance, one could talk about the cyanometal case that led to a dam that collapsed, which was holding quite significant amount of toxic waste, which was in this tailings dam. And the water that was polluted downstream, it flows into the Zambezi River. So the dam that collapsed went into Kafue River, which is one of the tributaries of Zambezi River that feeds an entire population between the two countries. So that's very, very important to take note that this is not only playing out, in Zimbabwe, but in the region. I think Susanna mentioned South Africa. There in South Africa, the issues mainly are, related to underground water, acidic water drainage system that are being contaminated over, historical mining that has been happening in the region. Beyond access, beyond competition, we have also seen that quite a number of companies, are trying to address this particular challenge. Of course, it's also an issue of climate change, to say these regions are very dry, but they hold these resources that are quite significant. So in one area, in one region, in the eastern part of the country, we have had some companies that have actually come to drill boreholes in dams that had dried up. And these are community dams that were, constructed long back, which the companies are now, trying to get water for purposes of processing their lithium. So the key point there, I think, for us to take note, at least from the Zimbabwean perspective, is that, the state is prioritizing mining over water rights by, being hard on and pushing value addition without understanding the cost or without having done the cost-benefit analysis. And one of the things that we have actually been also saying is, why don't we perhaps set up these processing plants or facilities in areas or in regions that have got significant amount of water, because it's not the entire country that is dry. So that's one of the things that we have been pushing for. However, companies sometimes, when they also try to respond to these challenges, they drill boreholes, but access becomes a challenge because some of the boreholes that they are drilling, they are within the mining concession, within the mining zone, which then becomes a challenge for communities to actually get in and have access to this water. So the similar, I think, challenges we're seeing in Zimbabwe are playing out in South Africa, in Zambia. And the question on accountability, I think, is what's remaining, because a lot of the legislation that regulate water, for instance, has not yet, I think, caught up with the developments that are happening when it comes to mining, given that this is particularly important in the context of the just energy transition. Let me end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Obear. I'm going to come back to you on that accountability question and explore sort of what meaningful accountability might look like. But first, let's go over to Reagan. Hey, Reagan. Reagan's joining us from Bangkok, where he arrived just 6 hours ago. So thank you for making it to the session today. So the Southeast Asia program has developed a really spectacular visual dashboard of mining activity in the region and its impacts on river health. It'd be helpful to hear from you on what prompted you to build the dashboard, what it's revealing about the relationship between mining and water health in Southeast Asia, and where you see the impact of the dashboard being most meaningful. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, so Susanna had mentioned it briefly. What prompted our program to work on this was what happened on the Gulf River. This actually started during Typhoon Yagi back in September of 2024. when a huge flood had run through the entire Kalk River basin, and the villagers there, or the communities living along the river, had experienced what they called kind of a different type of silt. It was a silt that they had never experienced before or felt before. It was a little tacky. Something was strange about it. But after that flood, during the dry season, normally the river itself would clear up and it'd be crystal blue. But from that typhoon onward, it remained muddy and turbid. And that was something that was very new to the river or to the communities as well. And a lot of the people who live along the river are close friends of ours, colleagues of ours, who we've worked with a lot on other issues like transboundary hydropower development in the Mekong. And they had asked us, our program is known for using satellite imagery to analyze and understand issues and concepts. And they had asked us to use satellite imagery to see if they could see what was happening, if we could see what was happening upstream. But it was very difficult for us to really see anything up until I think it was late last year or middle of last year when Sean Human Rights Foundation posted online about these two rare earth mines on the Kalk River and how they were just right above the border between Myanmar and Thailand, and they were probably likely culprits of what was happening to the river. And that prompted us to look more at what was happening around Myanmar, but also broadly the Mekong. A lot of the work that we did is based off of a lot of other organizations' great work, including Global Witness, who built up the data set in Kachin State, Sean Human Rights Foundation, who reported a lot in Shan State. But a lot of those were very static data sets. So we wanted to really kind of keep that up to date. So from when those data sets ended, we continued looking for more mines, and then we expanded our scope to include Laos because we had heard of rare earth mines opening up in Laos as well, as far back as 2022. So we started looking there, which was a bit more difficult, I would say. And from that point, starting at rare earths, we had some sources in the countries telling us that there were other types of mining that was happening that wasn't really being traced. And that's when we got into alluvial mining as well as heap leaching. Most of it, I would say, is probably on the unregulated, underregulated, and possibly illegal, generally all illicit to an extent. But these were all mining activities that weren't being monitored by the countries or by the region. Communities really were being impacted, but they couldn't really figure out what was happening. So we created this data set to kind of put that all up online for free and let people see what was happening in the region. That kind of opened the door. The availability of data really opened the door for a lot of people to take initiative and act upon themselves to do something about that. And I think one of the biggest things that happened from that was a lot more independent testing done by citizen scientists who were just very concerned by the river, by the mining in the rivers. That first started in the Kalk River, and that slowly expanded to the Salween. And then we started seeing that happening more in the Mekong. Eventually, a lot of the governments, as well as intergovernmental organizations like the Mekong River Commission, began to do additional testing throughout the river basin. And that was very informative. I think it really showed that, I think all the results actually showed that heavy metal presence were above WHO standards and that it was widespread, much more widespread than we had initially imagined, all the way down to Cambodia as well, where we saw some gold mines there. In that sense, from that point forward, I think a lot of the development partners who were investing in the Mekong region began to take a keen eye on this issue. And I think as of a couple of months ago, the government of Japan had about a $2.7 million grant to the Mekong River Commission for capacity building on water testing. And then the United Kingdom's FCDO also put in a grant for additional testing to about 50 different sites throughout the Mekong. I think that's kind of the first step. We're kind of in that gathering data step, but we're also beginning to engage with more communities that we think could benefit from understanding more about what was happening upstream and bring a lot of kind of disparate communities as well as non-state actors together to talk about this issue broadly.
Thank you, Reagan. That's fantastic. I'll come back to you, but appreciate you sharing background on the dashboard and sort of the impacts that it's had. I think it underscores the importance of data, right? But also that the sort of cooperation and engagement across communities to address what is really an issue that transcends boundaries. Scott, let's come to you. Irma has really it stands out as an organization that's really helping to inform social and environmental safeguards in this space. And you have a focus on water management in the standards that you've developed. Can you walk us through some of the key elements of water management that Irma is taking into account, and what conditions, sort of in law, policy, and in practice, are necessary to ensure that mining projects protect water resources and benefit communities? And I think in that, I think this is sort of like a best case scenario, but then we hear a lot about all of the challenges and also, illegal and unregulated mining. So how is Irma taking those issues into account as well?
Well, thanks so much, Lauren. And it really is an honor to be invited today and to join this discussion. For those who maybe aren't as familiar with the Irma system, we are a voluntary global standard and assurance provider for large-scale mining. We bring large-scale mines into increased transparency through independent third-party audits of industrial mines at the project level, so at the site level. Our standard for responsible mining was developed over more than a decade through a multi-stakeholder process involving industry, organized labor, mining-affected communities, NGOs, Indigenous peoples. And that process, I think, was unique in that each of those representatives and their constituencies had equal decision-making power. So what's in the Irma standard is a reflection of the consensus that coalition was able to reach. So at the highest level, Irma's approach to water management really recognizes, I think, what Suzanne, Obert, and Reagan have really been touching on, right? Which is the interconnected risks that mining poses. First, from contamination, from mine waste, but also in terms of the impacts on water availability for different water users, including sort of ecosystems and ecosystem services. So this Irma system, particularly the water chapters, really try to manage those risks as a single system. So preventing contamination at source, and then really ensuring that water use and management protect current and future water users. So broadly, the way that happens in the standard is first, is a design question. And so it's really companies being required to fully identify all water users, all waste streams and facilities, look at testing for acid rock drainage, metals leaching, building conceptual site models, and running sort of site-wide water balances. And so this is critical, right, from a design perspective, to both predict where your contamination risks might be coming from, but also to understand how much water a site or a process is going to be required, and who that might be competing with. So this has to happen at the beginning. It can't happen after impacts occur. Secondly, we apply a strict mitigation hierarchy. So in terms of that design process, sites, avoid or prevent and then contain risks within the site, and then only treat as a last resort. And so this really is trying to shift towards safer mine design. Thirdly, Irma has some pretty clear non-negotiables, as we might say. So in terms of riverine, submarine, and lake disposal of mine waste in the Irma system, those are sort of prohibited. And so sites that do conduct or do use those practices really are only able to get sort of the basic level of transparency in the Irma system. Fourthly, sort of Irma has a built-in sort of water management as a continuous process. And so this, in the sense that sites are required to have comprehensive monitoring systems that define sort of trigger levels, that use predictive tools, and build adaptive management plans. And so again, here the idea is that the sites are specifying in advance what actions will be taken when thresholds are exceeded. So, this could be, and this applies to both water quantity and water quality. So for example, responding to changes in groundwater levels, surface flows or extraction rates before they result in harm. And I think lastly, IRMA places communities really as a key part of sort of monitoring processes. And so I think as Reagan was talking about, communities must be able to participate in monitoring. They must be able to hire their own independent experts to be able to analyze data that they can use. And that data from the site should be available in accessible formats. And so I think that's really recognizing water as a shared resource. And I think that's embedded across the IRMA system. If I touch briefly on your second question, I think we are voluntary, as I said at the outset, and so we will never be a substitute for effective government regulation and enforcement. And so we need that. We need governments to set rules. We need them to require robust impact assessments and waste planning, and critically enforce those rules, including investigating breaches and, as Obet sort of talked about, actually applying sanctions and penalties effectively. But what is often missing is transparency. And that's really one of the places where the IRMA system can be a complement to, I think, creating value for sites to go beyond kind of legal compliance. But for us so in that sense, we can be a tool to help fill regulatory gaps when they exist. And so where there are weak governance models, we can be a tool that can bring increased transparency. But for voluntary systems like ours to be effective, we need to be trusted. And I think that's one of the places where, how we've approached trust building has been through that equal governance model that we have, by setting the bar, so in the terms of our standards, setting the bar high and aligning it with international human rights laws. And, our assessments are not, sites don't self-report. So again, through the IRMA system, we have independent auditors who go on site, who speak to workers, who speak to communities, who collect, or if communities are willing to share the data that they have collected, and really put that to work to verify how sites are performing. And then we publish those results so that everyone can get access to them, whether you're an end brand looking to sort of know where they're sourcing their lithium or their cobalt or their copper from, whether you're an investor, really looking to de-risk where your money might be going, or increase actually access to capital for sites that are willing to invest in the sort of best practices and really go beyond compliance. These are the sort of tools that I think the IRMA system can offer.
Thank you, Scott. Before we go to some of the questions that have come in, and I would again encourage the audience to share their questions, I wanted to open it to all of you in case you have sort of a reflection or a question, or sort of want to touch on a point that another panelist has made. And Ober, I see that you have come off mute, so I'm going to go to you first.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I was already on unmute button. But I think just to also comment the IRMA standard, I think one of the things that we have been doing in Zimbabwe has also been encouraging companies to be audited using that standard. So there are a number of, I think one company in the platinum sector, and a new one is coming up in the lithium sector, which is again located in a very water-strained region, and they are going to be audited using this IRMA standard. And we're looking forward to that process to see, to what extent they can meet, some of the, very, I don't want to say difficult, but I think very relevant, benchmarks of what accountability looks like in waste management, because there have been also, issues related to pollution in some of those projects that are, potentially looking to be audited using the IRMA standard. But I think another reflection point that I have is how some of the environmental impact assessment reports that we have analyzed do not at least have sufficient information about how the project is going to address water impacts. So particularly lithium, when you look at lithium processing, you've said it's a very water intensive process. But when you assess the environmental impact assessment report, when you analyze the report, The water piece is missing. It's not very clear in terms of how are you going to manage this risk, at least from the company side. So that's one thing that we have noticed. Then just, I think another important point that Regan mentioned around citizen science, working with communities to be able to do, water monitoring, do assessments. That's something that we have also started to do. But I mean, the challenge is always about, credibility. How, can you really trust that information? Because that's what, some authorities say. So, how was this water handled, where the sample was collected properly and the like. And where I think we need much more support would be on how we can expand that citizen science, particularly to areas that we know are prone to potential risk of pollution from processing some of the critical minerals that are being extracted. Yeah.
Thank you, Hubert. Susanna, let's come to you.
Yeah, listening to all these interesting points by my fellow panelists, I think one important thing to note is how much we're behind with addressing these mining-related water challenges generally, but especially in the water sector. If you look, for example, at national governments, but also specifically at basin organizations, if we stick a bit to the transboundary dimension, it's in a way surprising to see how little basin organizations have dealt with it. And Regan was talking about the MRC just recently having received this Japanese and UK funding to address at least data gaps when it comes to mining related water quality issues. But on the other hand, I think it's also important to keep in mind that there are so many other things that these organizations deal with. And if we stick to the Zambezi that Hubert mentioned, or the Mekong that Regan mentioned, both organizations, which I think in both cases, the MRC and SAMCOM, we can consider as quite advanced basin organizations, have been busy with all sorts of things. And for quite some time until now, hydropower and dam building. So another sort of very important and very detrimental often development has been very high on their agenda. And only recently they've moved into water quality things, because for a long time, I think the water community has also been thinking that in many of these rivers, water quantity was the much bigger challenge. It was much more likely to lead to conflict. Water quality was something that a lot of people considered as, oh, that's more cooperative. That's something that is either not a challenge or countries cooperate on anyway. And then only recently, these basin organizations have started to look into water quality. If you look at the ZAMCOM, for example, with the SAMWIS information system, yes, there is water quality monitoring, but that's focusing more on phosphorus, nitrogen, and things like that. So there's also a lot of catch-up work to be done for these basin organizations and for the governments. At the same time, there's decreasing attention to them, there's decreasing funding for them. I mean, the Japan and UK examples, Regan, that you brought are really exceptions, unfortunately, at the moment. So I think that is a main challenge that I think that we have to recognize. In addition to the fact that a lot of the mining that's happening also, especially if we look at the Mekong, is illegal. So there we're facing a totally different field where all the nice regulation, even if we had it, wouldn't be particularly helpful. Thanks.
Thank you, Susanna. Scott, I wanted to give you an opportunity to come in.
Absolutely. So there was one question has come through in the Q&A specifically about downstream companies. So these are the companies that are either purchasing or processing mined materials, and the role that they play and the role that finance plays in perhaps sending market signals to mining companies to implement, really high, bar standards, or really, as I sort of said, really implementing the sorts of best practice, sort of rights-aligned preventative work that needs to happen. And I would agree. I think that they are playing a really important role today. And so in the IRMA system, we have membership across the automotive, consumer electronic, the jewelry sector, increasingly sort of renewable energy companies, so wind power. And to be members within IRMA, they need to be making that ask of their supply chains. So that's sometimes that appears as a contractual obligation. We will source from you if there is sort of progressive improvement towards, or there's steps to be taken towards increasing transparency, going through the independent third-party assurance process. Sometimes it's still more in the encouragement, right? We certainly know there isn't enough mined material out there that has gone through this level of scrutiny in the world today, but with it's changing. But there's definitely a difference between the sort of the complexity of the supply chain. For some of those minerals where the supply chains are shorter, where it's easier to see, easier to know where you're sourcing from, I think that's where we're seeing that pressure be more effective. Where it's more opaque, we definitely need to see increased transparency over the that sort of supply chain transparency to sort of help increase, I think, that leverage. Maybe just about also just quick comment there on the EIAs. I think we absolutely see such variation in the quality of those sorts of documents. And so I think that there's a real need to rethink the environmental and social impact assessment process and how we build and bring increased, whether it's peer review, sort of scrutiny over those, both the framing in terms of the scopes of them and then also their sort of final products so that they can be increased trust and reliability in terms of what they're, because they're still such an important decision-making tool. And then lastly, Reagan, I think your point, and Bert also touched on this, I think there's such an opportunity to think and build more opportunity for citizen science in terms of monitoring environmental pollutants. Within the IRMA standard, we have a very clear requirement that says, if asked, by communities, sites should create funds or make funding available for communities to hire their own independent experts, whether that's PhDs. There should be, processes to disclose in real time the sorts of monitoring data that is needed, and then to have resources available so that communities can participate and kind of engage with that data in a meaningful way, and then leverage the different influencing strategies that they might have, whether it's with governments and brands or so on. And we're seeing some interesting examples. And so when we look at the audits that are currently published in the IRMA system, we're seeing more examples of that type of model being used in different places. Not everywhere, and that's absolutely, I think, where the opportunity lies for sort of some of these really, but I think that's just a really good example of innovative practice that we could be pushing.
Thank you, Scott. Let's see, Reagan, did you want to come in at all, or should I ask a question?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. To Susanna's point, I think, the river basin organizations have historically, especially the MRC has historically focused on hydropower for obvious reasons. But I also think it's limited in its scope because of its mandate to only look into the Mekong mainstream when all of the mines are occurring in tributaries, which really limits its scope of like where it can test. And that's when we really need to bring in some of the member countries, all of the member countries, in fact, who I think, to an extent have the responses have been a bit lackluster, depending on, who you ask. But we do see some kind of movement forward in terms of, Cambodia's Ministry of Environment doing some general testing on river streams with some gold mines in them and then closing down some of them. Laos announcing the crackdown on illegal mines, especially on gold. And then, those are kind of the two examples that I can only think of. But then also to your water quality as a lower priority, I think that's correct as well. But I also think it set a precedent of a lack of information on the pre-event river conditions. I don't think there's enough information about what the Mekong was like before, and we only really have information of what the Mekong is now. And it's kind of hard to kind of set that or find some kind of precedent when it doesn't exist. And we're only seeing, announcements of high standards of heavy metals above WHO standards and water quality deteriorating. Those are kind of my two comments.
Yeah, if I may, just a very short comment, because that makes my international water law heart beat a bit faster. I think it's very important to keep in mind that the Mekong River Commission's mandate is not limited to the Mekong mainstream. There has been some push in recent years by some countries to convey that message. But if you looked at the agreement, the 1995 agreement very clearly says in the preamble, but also in various articles, that it refers to the Mekong River Basin's water And the basin, also if you look at the UN Watercourse Convention, for example, is clearly defined as the tributaries and the mainstream. And I think that is very important to keep in mind. Obviously, that doesn't apply to Myanmar, not being a party to the 1995 Mekong Agreement, but it does apply to the other countries. So I would say that the MRC definitely has a mandate there and a role to play. And it has worked on other water quality issues before, many of them also originating more from the tributaries. So I think especially given that we are seeing in the Mekong, but also in other basins like the Congo, for example, countries increasingly arguing that a treaty would only apply to the mainstream, which obviously serves the purpose of limiting their responsibilities in the tributaries, where, as you rightly say, a lot of developments are happening. I think it's important to keep in mind it's the basin and not only the mainstream. Sorry, I just had to quickly come in on that.
Okay, good point. And it's interesting because your point that that there has been some pushing of that narrative, right? And so it speaks to where there are incentives for it to be more narrowly defined. There's a question in the chat from James Chidakwa, who is Southern Africa Coordinator for African Parliamentary Networks on Illicit Financial Flows and Tax. The question is, in the face of pushback from affected communities sparking supply chain risks, what incentives, such as tax reforms or green bonds, should policymakers offer to shift mining toward water positive practices across these regions? I think this is sort of getting at where are the policy levers that are fit for purpose that should be sort of built in. And Aubert, I might come to you first on this. And also expand it maybe a little bit to also have you speak a little bit more to what accountability needs to look like in this space. And Aubert actually is frozen for me. So maybe we will not start with Aubert. Is there somebody else who would like to jump in on this question in terms of what are the incentives that policymakers could use, sort of the carrot side of the carrots and sticks? Oh, Aubert, are you back?
Lauren, maybe while Aubert is
Yeah,
just
why don't you go ahead,
connecting,
Scott? Thank you.
I probably won't be able to say too much about green bonds, tax reforms necessarily, but I think some of the, in terms of financing of projects and sort of the conditions that maybe some development finance or other systems can offer, I think can really tie in some of these really important site level requirements in terms of both disclosures, both in terms of the resourcing for community participation, in terms of disclosing the sort of data. I think that's really, really, really important, whether that's baseline and background data, the sort of the disclosure around the adaptive management plans, the timing and frequency of what's being collected, what's being tracked in terms of pollutants and the volumes of water that's being taken and so on. I think there are ways that we can think about financing into different places that's tied to projects that could really, I think, create some of the conditions for those businesses that are really looking to access new forms of capital in a way that requires them, of course, to then demonstrate the sort of best practices that we're talking about. Maybe you probably can say more about it in the Zim context.
Over to you, Aubert.
So my network is not great. So I dropped for a moment. Just I think for me to add, just a few points to say, I think what we have seen, I think in terms of tax incentives, increasingly governments offer the tax incentives, encouraging companies to invest. But we haven't seen use of penalties, say, for instance, good behavior, good corporate behavior. You could also benefit out of those kind of incentives or green bonds. So I think what we might need actually is to look at Where has these incentives worked in terms of encouraging good behavior, particularly when it comes to managing environmental or water conflicts? There is by, I think, IGF, intergovernmental said, way in tax work. In most instances, if countries have not done proper homework in terms of understanding what is the risk to revenue that they could lose, and ultimately you can have a conversation about how that can also reduce the ultimate rate of taxation. So I think it's a conversation that is important to have, to say when would tax incentives work potentially for encouraging companies to be much more responsible in how they interact with this particular issue. Yeah.
Thank you, Hubert. There have been a couple of questions in the chat about data. One is from Mark Detman. What is the role of water data, water quality and quantity to play to improve accountability? And then another one that just came in from Solomon Nava. NISO, what digital tools are available to support effective long-term monitoring of water resources in mining affected areas? And I think, Reagan, you had made a point, they sort of need the baseline, right, and to work off of. And so I put that question to all of you, and what kinds of data are most helpful, most impactful? Where are the current gaps, and where do you see there are opportunities to close some of those gaps?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start. I think some of the more helpful or useful kind of parameters are those that can be collected in situ. And so that be, right downstream of the mine, but also upstream of the mine, to really understand and, define what is the impact of said mine on kind of a smaller scale. But if we look broadly, I think it's going to be much more prohibitive, both physically and just operationally, to do that across an entire river basin. That's when we need to bring in non-traditional data sources like remote sensing using satellite imagery, hyperspectral, to really understand the impacts of that. And there are libraries of kind of identifiable traces of elements on the surface using hyperspectral, which can be used to really help expand the scope of that. But I think what needs to really be done is, how does that data become implemented in some kind of manner? What does it do once you have that data? A good example of something that was done is what happened in Malaysia. They have one rare earth mine. It's legal. It's a kind of a test pilot to, how to get rare earth using in situ leaching, which is similar to what you see in Myanmar and Laos. And they had some kind of parameters on the level of radioactive material present there. And it had gone past that, way above past that level, and they closed it down. They shut down, or they suspended the operations briefly. The mine itself is not a great example, because I think whether it is legal or illegal, it's still a pretty bad mine, and it is still affecting the environment. But the fact that there was some kind of standard and they used it and they shut it down temporarily is much better than what we're seeing in Myanmar and Laos.
Thank you, Reagan. I think that your point about how it's used is an important one. Susanna, how can data, or how is data being used to inform better governance, and sort of your point about institutions not actually following the frameworks that we have in place, and can data be a useful prompt for better cooperation?
I think it can, either directly by just knowing what the problem is, and we have this good old saying that you can't manage what you don't know in the water sector, so that's definitely sort of the direct line. But I think also indirectly, and it was mentioned by another panelist earlier, the whole question of transparency of consumers or companies further down the supply chain, just being aware of how and where things are happening in certain ways, I think is very important. So yes, absolutely d'accord on the question of data is needed to address the problem. The challenge, though, is, and we know that more than enough from other challenges in the water field, is that very often we don't have enough data, and we keep on saying we don't have enough data, and we keep on saying that we have to collect more data before we can do something. So I think it's super important to keep in mind that a lack of data, which is a big issue, especially in the mining water nexus, should not prevent us from taking action, also precautionary action. So just that maybe as a word of caution.
Yes, absolutely. Good point. Okay, we're at the end of our time, so I'm going to ask one final question and give each of you an opportunity to respond. We've talked about a lot of the gaps in this space, right? Whether they're governance gaps, accountability, data gaps. Which gap, from your perspective, if closed first, would do the most to protect water in mining affected communities? Who wants to go first? I'm going to choose you, Scott.
Thanks, Lauren. I would say I think the transparency piece needs to be closed. We have sites that are already disclosing the sort of data that I think then accountability activists inside and outside government can really, really use. And so it's technically possible. There's sites already doing it. We need the rest of the mining industry to be required to do that.
Thank you. Reagan. Sorry, I should have given you the jet lag delay.
I'll say enforcement only because, as Susanna said, you can have all the data you want, you can have all the governance you want, but if it's not being enforced, then there's no point in all this. It's all paperwork. It's just things on your laptop. But to enforce it, I think is the last kind of step. We do know that a lot of mines, even if they are legal, they are underregulated, if not unregulated, and that just is just as bad as any other mine out there. So I think with the enforcement side, it's a lack of enforcement is such a big remaining issue around the world, and that can lead to a lot of different kind of issues that we don't really have to mention. But it is, I think, for me, one of the bigger ones. But it is also almost the last step of what gaps are remaining. So all other gaps remaining would also be enforced anyway. Yeah.
It's an impossible question to answer, but I appreciate the enforcement piece is really important, of course. Aubert, over to you.
Yeah, I think I agree with Regan that I think enforcement, from our standpoint, being on the ground, we see that as one of the major gaps. Of course, you could talk about some of the legal and policy gaps, but I think overall, I think internationally, one of the principles that have been accepted, at least in most jurisdictions, is the polluter pays principle. But when it comes to its enforcement, we don't see it, I think, happening on the ground. So I would, I think, agree 100% that enforcement is one of the major gaps that would, if addressed first, bring a little bit of some impact and change to, this problem. Yeah.
Thank you. And Susanna.
Yeah, I agree with the other panelists. I would say it's governance, which I would understand really broadly from having the right legislation, having the institutions, but also having everything being implemented, and then obviously being enforced where that is needed. I think there are also many other gaps when it comes to, for example, also technology development, data, and so on. But ultimately there we can make progress, whereas on the governance side, things seem to rather be moving backwards. So that's maybe not only the biggest gap, but also the biggest concern for me right now.
Yes, absolutely. I want to thank you all for being here with us today and thank those of you who tuned in and asked questions. I want to thank Claire Doyle, who really put a lot of work into pulling this panel together and is helping to lead our critical minerals work at the Stimson Center. The session will be recorded and archived on the Stimson Center website. We'll likely have a write-up of it on our blog, New Security Beat. Susanna, Scott, Reagan, Aubert, thank you so much for your time today. And thank you to the Stimson Center communications team for making this possible. Have a good